comes from the book of Genesis. It tells the beginning of the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years old and tended the flock with his brothers. While he was helping the sons of Levi and Zilpah, his father's wives, Joseph told their father unflattering things about them. Now Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was born when Jacob was old. Jacob had made for him a long robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him and couldn't even talk nicely to him. Joseph had a dream and told it to his brothers, which made them hate him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. When we were binding stalks of grain in the field, my stalk got up and stood upright, while your stalks gathered around it and bowed down to my stalk." His brothers said to him, "Will you really be our king and rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of the dreams he told them. If you are familiar with the story of Joseph, you will remember that his brothers' hatred eventually led them to sell Joseph into slavery, stain his robe with animal blood, and lead their father to believe Joseph had been killed. Joseph ended up being sold to an Egyptian official named Potiphar, who recognized Joseph's skill and made him head of his household. But Joseph's woes were not over yet. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. Sometime later, his master's wife became attracted to Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." He refused and said to his master's wife, "With me here, my master doesn't pay any attention to anything in his household. He has put everything under my supervision. No one is greater than I am in this household, and he hasn't denied me anything except you, since you are his wife. How could I do this terrible thing and sin against God?"
I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't love a great story. Don't we all? And more importantly, aren't we all keepers of the greatest story ever told? Aren't we all people who, by our words and our lives, supposed to witness to that story? We are actors, all of us, in the greatest story ever told, because the story of God and God's incomprehensible love is a story that continues to be told through us. Our story is part of God's larger story. And I think once we see that, we understand that there are really two perspectives to our story. There is our perspective, which is limited by time and space. And then there is God's perspective. How many times have you looked back on a time in your life, and from the benefit of a little distance, you can see God's presence, when at the time you felt like you were all alone? People who study literature tell us that most great stories have certain common elements. You usually have an unlikely hero, an unplanned adventure or adventures. There's usually conflict, there's twists and trials as the plot thickens, a need for that unlikely hero to embrace transformation, and then finally bringing that he has learned or she has learned back to the larger community. Some of the stories in the Bible contain these elements, but perhaps none more than the story of Joseph. It is the longest story in the Old Testament. The story of Joseph takes up more space in Genesis. It is longer than the individual stories of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. It's a story of ups and downs, but it is a story that gives the reader a glimpse of how God's hand is in it all. We kind of, as you read through the story of Joseph, we're actually allowed this backstage kind of view of what is going on, or we have this larger perspective because of the way the story is written. Joseph is not only an unlikely hero, he is a rather unlikable character. The first thing we read about Joseph after his birth is that he was a tattletale. At the age of 17, he is helping his brothers tend sheep, but we are told he runs back to Jacob to say unkind things about the job that his brothers are doing. And the second thing that we learn about Joseph is that he is overindulged. Joseph is his father's favorite, something Jacob failed to hide from his other children. Jacob has crafted for Joseph a special coat, a long robe. Now, because of the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, many of us have this idea that Joseph received a coat of many colors. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Hebrew scriptures just say that Joseph received a long robe, or it could be translated a robe with long sleeves. Either way you translate it, this wasn't a working class garment. The robe distinguished Joseph from all of his brothers, and every time he wore it, it reminded his brothers that Joseph was their father's favorite. And then there are the dreams. You heard the first one in our scripture reading this morning. It's clear that Joseph sees this dream as a reason to gloat over his brothers. All Joseph can see in this dream is his own glory. He goes on then to tell them a second dream. I've just dreamed again, he says, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he described this dream to his father and brothers, his father scolded him and said to him, what kind of dreams are you dreaming? Am I and your mother and your brothers supposed to come and bow down in front of you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father, we are told, took careful note of the matter. Jacob had already fought some of his own battles with God, so Jacob has learned at least to wait and see what is going to happen. But Joseph's obnoxiousness and his insensitivity shine through pretty clearly. So I'll ask you to remember back just a few years, if you can, to when you were 17 years old. What were you like? Was there any room for improvement in your character? And if you could now, what would you want to tell your 17-year-old self? At this point in the story, Joseph is an insensitive, spoiled tattletale who dreams of greatness for himself. He's an unlikely character and an unlikely hero, but God has a plan for Joseph. And that plan will involve some twists and turns that definitely were not a part of any of Joseph's dreams. When he is sent to check on his brothers, they throw Joseph into a well while they decide whether to kill him or not. Luckily for Joseph, they settle on selling him instead as a slave to a caravan passing by. And that isn't even the worst thing that happens to him. Now imagine that for a minute. You're sold into slavery, and that is not the worst thing that happens in your life. Joseph ends up going to Potiphar, an Egyptian official. And we are told that Potiphar recognizes that God is with Joseph. And everything he puts his hand to turns out successful. So Joseph works his way up to being second in command in Potiphar's household. And there his troubles only deepen. Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph, and we are told in the Bible that every single day she tries to entice him to sleep with her. And when Joseph refuses her attentions, she goes so far as to grab him, and Joseph runs right out of his robe to get away from him. And she uses that robe to falsely accuse him of attacking her. Now, Joseph just can't catch a break with these robes, can he? First, he's given this special robe by his father, which his brothers used to convince his father that he's been eaten by wild animals. And then he loses his robe to Potiphar's wife, which she uses to convince her husband that Joseph attacked her. Both times, Joseph is left naked and in a lot of trouble. But there is a significant difference here. The first time, Joseph had a coat, but he didn't have a whole lot of character to go with that special coat. The second time, Joseph loses his robe because he has developed character. Every single day, Joseph turned down this woman's propositions and even avoided being anywhere near her. Somewhere along the way, we discover that Joseph has learned to be loyal and steadfast to someone besides himself. Somewhere along the way, Joseph has grown up, and he has come to recognize that God has a place in his life. Now we can read, but for all his trouble, Potiphar believes his wife, and Joseph gets thrown into prison. So much for doing the right thing. Now there are two ways that we can read Joseph's story, two ways in which we can even identify with Joseph's story. We can read this story and we can see a guy who has really bad luck, who just cannot catch a break. We can see a victim. Or we can read Joseph's story and we can see someone who has been blessed even through some of life's greatest challenges. The story itself hints at which way we are supposed to read it. We are told, while he was in jail, the Lord was with Joseph and remained loyal to him. He caused the jail's commander to think highly of Joseph. The jail's commander put all of the prisoners under Joseph's supervision, and he was the one who determined everything that happened in that jail. The jail commander, we are told, paid no attention to anything under Joseph's supervision because the Lord was with him and made everything he did successful. Every single life takes unexpected and often painful turns. I have never yet met anyone who has not experienced suffering in their lives, and some people seem like they just can't catch a break. The suffering seems to come in wave after wave. One of my colleagues, a young man, father of 3 young children, was on track to be ordained this year. But he is not going through that process because they have discovered cancer near his lung. And so instead of preparing his ordination papers, he will be undergoing chemotherapy and radiation and whatever kinds of treatments they're given. Sudden, unexpected, painful twist. Every person experiences hurt and heartache at some point in their lives, usually at several points in our lives. And I'm not sure that we are honest enough about that in church. I read just the other day the account of a young woman who wrote that when she began attending Christian events, she was in high school, and she said when she began attending Christian events, concerts and seminars and church even, she often heard an underlying principle in all of the messages. And this was the principle: all humans have a life before they ask Jesus into their hearts and a life after. And the life after is filled with joy and purpose. And once you have that joy, life is golden. As a result, she said, she developed an immature faith. And she writes, I thought if I just tried harder, or prayed the right things, then those painful things wouldn't happen in my life. Or at least I would have control over how they happened. You know, lucky for her, this young woman also spent quite a bit of time reading the Bible on her own. And the stories she found there told her that once people began to follow God, their lives didn't necessarily get better. In fact, oftentimes their lives got significantly more complicated. What distinguished the lives of these men and women in the Bible was that their stories had been taken up and made part of God's story. Their plot twists, good and bad, found meaning within God's greater story. I think we would provide a much better witness if we were more upfront with people about this. We are going to experience heartache and suffering in this world, whether we follow God or not. The difference is that with God, we are given the opportunity to find meaning even in our suffering. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and Holocaust survivor. And through his own personal experiences and in a concentration camp, as well as the experiences of his patients, Frankl decided that in some way, suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. He went on to write, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Joseph's story can intersect with our story at many different points. The embarrassing attitudes of a teenager, having to bear the natural consequences of suffering for our attitudes or behaviors, having to suffer unjustly because of the attitudes or behaviors of others. Most of us can probably identify with the temptation to see ourselves as victims when bad things descend on us. But if we do that, then we end up stuck in the pain and stuck in the suffering. This story teaches us that we have a choice. We can choose instead to rely on the God who has promised to be faithful to us always. We can, no matter what situation we find ourselves in, choose to use the gifts God has given us to serve others. We can choose to embrace the adventure of life, realizing there will be ups and downs, but understanding that we never, ever walk that road alone. Joseph used his gifts when he was brought as a slave to Egypt, when he was unjustly thrown into prison. He continued to use the gifts God had given him. And through these difficult times, Joseph begins to see that his dreams of glory were really a vision of leadership. And with God's help, he hones that skill, both in Potiphar's house and in the prison. And there is one more plot twist in this part of Joseph's story that is perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, and one I think that we must acknowledge before we move on. Two other men are thrown into jail during Joseph's time there. Pharaoh's baker and his wine steward have somehow offended their leader of Egypt. And after some time in jail, each man has a dream. And in the morning, Joseph notices that they look distressed and asks them what is wrong. Again, we see that somewhere along the way, Joseph has developed an empathy that he didn't have earlier in the story. Suffering does have a way of doing that for us. They share their concerns with Joseph over the troubling dreams that they have had, and this time, rather than glorifying himself as a dream interpreter, Joseph reminds them that the interpretation of dreams belongs to God. And if Joseph is able to interpret their dreams for them, it is because God has given him that gift. And he offers to use this gift in service to them. According to the dreams, the chief baker is soon to be hanged. The wine steward is soon going to be restored to his position. Now, when Joseph interpreted the wine steward's dream, he asked that when this wine steward was restored, he would remember Joseph. That he would remember to tell the ruler of Egypt that there was a man unjustly suffering in prison. And both of the interpretations proved true. The baker was hanged, the wine steward was restored to his position. But then we read, but the chief wine steward didn't remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. For 2 more years, Joseph was in that prison, forgotten. Have you ever gotten to that point where you feel like you've endured enough character development? You know, where you just want to say, enough already, God. I have gotten the point. I think I'm as good as I'm going to get. Just lay up on the suffering here because I don't think it's going to do any more good. I think we can all relate to the words of the psalmist who writes, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" How hard is it when our lives are so affected by the decisions or the choices that other people make? Joseph started out as an unlikable character and an unlikely hero. But by this point in the story, you know, we find ourselves pulling for him. We want that wine steward to remember him. We want Joseph to receive some vindication. He's been wounded again and again. He was betrayed. He was sold. He was falsely accused. He was imprisoned, and now he is forgotten. Yet it was these very wounds that revealed God to Joseph. It was these wounds that taught Joseph the skills he would need to have in the future. And it was these wounds that eventually put Joseph in a position to help others, even his own family. There is a reason why we so often ask why when there are seemingly no good answers. when bad things happen and we ask why, and we know that there's never going to be an answer that satisfies that longing. We do it because finding meaning in our suffering allows a struggle to become a sacred scar, a scar that can receive redemption and become a place of healing, not just for us, but for others as well. Throughout his life, Joseph learns to find God's hand in his story, to not give up on his dreams, to become a person that God can use in a powerful way. That is the posture of a hero, an unlikely hero, but a hero. Joseph wasn't a hero because he possessed some superhuman quality. Joseph becomes a hero because he hangs on, and he trusts God, and he does the best he can in all the situations that he is faced with, even the darkest ones. And you know what? We can all be that kind of hero. We may be unlikely heroes, but we can all be that kind of hero in our story when we allow our story to be part of God's greater story. Will you please pray with me? Almighty God, you know our hearts, our minds, our thoughts, our needs, our fears, and our dreams. Help us to know you, to trust you through all the times of our lives. Give us the ability to see that our story is a part of your greater story, and that even painful times can serve as preparation for the tasks you have prepared for us. Give us the eyes to see that you are with us always, even in the lonely, the unpleasant places. And be with all this day who suffer, who feel betrayed, abandoned, or forgotten. As Jesus prayed, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven,